Next, we're going to move on to the very first session today with two presenters. Our first session would focus on China. Moderating the session will be Amir Farid Abdul Rahim. Amir is currently serving as the Publications and Political Risk Analyst at Regional Consultancy KRA Group. Let's welcome them to the stage.
Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning, everyone. Assalamu alaikum and good morning to Datuk Rohana, Datuk Sri Johan, Datuk Faizal, and the rest of young corporate Malaysians. First of all, I would like to congratulate you guys for getting up very early on a Saturday morning, putting on your tie and jacket, and filling this hall this morning. First and foremost, I would like to put a disclaimer onto my profile in the booklet. I did not type it myself. I'm a public affairs analyst, so I know how to do my own my profile, and that wasn't done by me. So anyhow, and yeah, I'm not a publications person. I'm a public affairs, and I do cover political risk. And I would like to thank Dr. Rohana, actually, for bringing up Indonesia, because most of my work is Indonesia, and she is very right in pointing out that Indonesia should be part of today's discussion. It is not just the next frontier, it is actually the new frontier. And as she rightly pointed out, many Malaysians are already there, because it's so close, it's a 2-hour flight away. More and more Malaysian companies are going there. So, ladies and gentlemen, before I don't want to get started on Indonesia. My focus today is China, and I am joined by two great experts, Mr. Hugo Restall and Jude Blanchette. It is ironic, actually, that we're talking about China, and yet we have two Western faces here. But as an Indonesian observer myself, I know that if you're looking into a country from outside, then you would be able to understand it. And this is a testimony, actually, to the growing importance of China. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no specific topic discussion for this session. It is just on, the title says, on China. And how we are going to structure it is as such that we are going to touch on the economy, the corporate culture, socio-political trends, as well as politics and government. And later on, after the two speakers will present for 15 minutes, we'll speak on issues which are close to their heart in China, and then we will open up the topic for discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living now, as you know, in the dawn of the Asian century. Everyone is talking about it. You are right, China and India. Every day now, when we wake up in the morning, we open up, we go to Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, The Economist. Everyone is covering China and India, and so much so that I myself feel now that I know more about China, but I've only traveled there twice. Actually, one to Beijing, once to Hong Kong. But the media has made it as such. China and India both are very important issues discussed in the mainstream. So much so that we are all aware that currently there is growing social unrest in China. I was just picking up some facts. Last year alone, there were 280,000 or so incidents where people sent petitions, had peaceful rallies. These are some of the social trends which we would like to discuss in this topic, in this session. And as you are also aware, recently the Chinese government has abandoned their, not abandoned, but they were really hitting on inflation earlier this year. But now the monetary policy and the outlook for 2012 is going to go for growth. They are freeing up they're lowering the reserve requirement, freeing up about $50 billion into the market, and we will see more activities there. And another trend that I would like to pick up is that the politics in China, it's very much predicted. Everyone knows who is going to be the president. of China in 2012. But it is one of the topics that I hope our panelists can pick on later on. So I haven't actually. Okay. All right. Without further ado, now let's start the discussion. And Hugo Restall, my friend, editor of Wall Street Journal's opinion page, he will present his case for today on China.
Thank you very much, Amir. I will try to keep my remarks pretty brief so that we can come back to different topics. So I'm going to touch on a very wide range of things. I guess I'll start with the Chinese economy, since that impacts so many of the other aspects of what we're talking about. It certainly seems, looking at the headline growth numbers, that China is immune to the problems that are going on in the rest of the world. But we've started to learn in the last few months that that's not really the case. China is facing headwinds in a lot of different areas, and while I wouldn't dare to predict that China is going to experience anything that could be called a crash, I think it is going to face a difficult year next year. I'll just run through some of those headwinds. Of course, the most obvious being the low external demand. Europe is its largest market for its exports. And of course, the turmoil in Europe is having an impact on orders for factories. We're seeing that in the manufacturing purchasing index, which has been below 50, so in negative territory for the last couple of months. We're also seeing property prices falling in China. That's a new phenomenon to see it happening so broad-based and in such a concerted fashion. You have to remember that the Chinese property market is relatively young. It's only been around for about a decade in terms of widespread purchases of private housing. And so this is very disturbing, I think, for a lot of Chinese people who have, in the last 10 years, grown to think of property as an investment that only goes up. As the rest of the world has already realized, that is not always the case. Part of the problem with property is that the Chinese property developers have been building a lot of luxury housing because that's the segment of the market in which they make the most profit. And the reason for that is that a lot of China's wealthy are storing their wealth in property. So while there is definitely an undersupply of housing for the lower end of the market, people are very dissatisfied with the fact that the working class cannot find decent housing. The upper part of the market is in oversupply. This problem now of the falling property prices has a lot of knock-on effects. For instance, local governments across China rely on property for about 40% of their revenue. And now that land sales are drying up, transactions are drying up, they have to start trying to raise revenue from other sources, such as finding new taxes and fees to levy. And that feeds back into social unrest as the people who are being taxed, the companies that are being taxed, feel the pain. And then there's also a problem of demographics. China is now facing, for the first time, the cohort of young people who would be going to work in the factories. That age cohort is starting to shrink. And in the next few years, we'll actually see the dependency ratio start to go up, the number of young and old people as compared to the working population. But at the same time, that's driving up wages. But at the same time, we also have a problem of unemployment in some places. It seems paradoxical, but after the 2008 crisis, the Chinese government embarked on a massive expansion of credit and also a lot of infrastructure projects in the interior to soak up the workers who were not finding jobs in the factories on the coast. And a lot of those projects are now reaching completion, and the workers are looking for new jobs. And the workers in the factories on the coast may actually have to accept some wage decreases as there's a surplus of labor as those workers come back to the coast. So in some ways, I think this is a perfect storm, and we see it. We also see it in the banks, which are facing problems of liquidity, even though the Chinese government is now loosening its monetary policy. Those banks have embarked on a program of developing wealth management products to try to attract deposits. And as they have to pay back those the returns on those wealth management products, they have to have cash flow. And this is something new actually for the Chinese banking system. In the past, essentially it was able to continue rolling over loans and making new loans to state-owned enterprises, but now they actually have to look for some of those loans to be repaid in order to meet their own obligations. And so I think we'll continue to see liquidity crunch in the banks. So all of these problems are a big hangover from the 2008 crisis and the way that China responded to it by telling the banks to lend, lowering interest rates, but primarily telling the banks to push credit out the door in whatever means possible. That's now starting to come back to bite the government because local governments borrow too much for projects that won't have sufficient return to service that debt. A lot of companies borrowed to invest in real estate, and now with falling real estate prices, those loans may also go bad. So it's not really that much unlike the US facing a hangover from a long credit boom. Now the irony to all this is that China resisted revaluing its currency for so long because it was afraid of the experience of Japan in the 1980s when it suffered a bubble after they revalued the yen, the Plaza Accord. The Bank of Japan, seeing its exporters facing the problems of a rising yen, chose to keep interest rates very low, created a bubble, and when that burst, Japan went into its 2 decades now of lost growth. So China was very wary of that experience, but ironically, they've fallen into pretty much exactly the same trap. Of course, the precipitating event was different. Rather than being forced to appreciate their currency, they were faced with the 2008 global financial crisis. But essentially, their response was the same: create a massive credit expansion, and probably the result will be similar in terms of some years of lost growth. And this is all related ultimately to a system that doesn't allocate credit based on the price of that credit. It doesn't function based on interest rates. It functions basically on the government telling the banks what to do and the local bank managers and local government officials deciding what companies, enterprises should receive credit. Of course, this, as with all state-planned economic systems, leads to a lot of waste and lost capital. So I think we're looking at several different possibilities, possible scenarios here, but none of them are particularly encouraging. One of them might be for a kind of a period of stagflation. Of course, in the context of China, stagflation might not mean actually a shrinking economy, but just a very slow growing economy by its standards, with persistent problems with inflation. Or, as this property bubble bursts, there may be a period of deflation. But in either case, I think the way out of this problem for China is to re-energize its reform program, which has essentially been stalled since about 2005, 2006. If we look at the history of the last 10 years, after the 2001 accession to the World Trade Organization, China experienced a boom as a result of that reform and closing of a lot of state-owned enterprises. But that reform essentially came to an end around 2005, 2006. And since then, it's been coasting and using cheap credit to propel growth. So China needs further opening of its economy, especially the service sector. It also needs to reform the financial system so that credit is allocated according to commercial lending practices. Ironically, before 2008, it was on the road to doing that. The banks were starting to conduct real credit risk analysis, but that was pretty much thrown out the window in the stimulus program of 2009. So the price of capital needs to go up. The banks need to be put on a commercial footing. And as a result of that, resources will shift from the corporate sector to the household sector. Wages will rise. We'll get greater domestic consumption, and that will be a true rebalancing of the economy. At the moment, although there's a lot of talk of rebalancing, actually investment as a percentage of the economy continues to rise, may even be over 50% now. And next year is expected to continue to rise. If investment runs at 9% growth and the economy only grows at 8%, it's easy to see that investment as a share of GDP is going to continue growing. So, okay, so that's the economic outlook. Just quickly go into a few other topics. The corporate climate for Malaysian companies, other foreign companies, it's very much a mixed bag. What we hear is generally a lot of complaints. Of course, it's never been easy to do business in China, but particularly the policies now are making it more difficult for foreign companies to move up the value chain within China. So if you're an exporter making relatively simple products, China now is presenting challenges in terms of wage prices, the value of the yuan, but the government policy environment is still relatively welcoming. But if you're trying to do something more sophisticated, there's a lot of pressure. There's restrictions based on certification, licensing. These are designed to protect local companies. There are also requirements that foreign companies transfer their intellectual property in order to enter the Chinese market. They may be forced to join a joint venture, for example, in certain industries. And once that intellectual property is within China, of course, we know that the protections for that are very shaky. China's commitment to fulfilling its WTO requirements of its accession agreement has been a bit shakier in recent years also. It's failed, for instance, to open up the credit card, debit card payment system. China UnionPay still maintains a monopoly, even though it was supposed to have opened up that market several years ago. The rare earths and other restrictions on other raw material exports is another way in which the government is trying to force foreign companies to bring sophisticated manufacturing within China.